Warm greetings and good morning. I really hope you all are keeping safe and fine in this time of pandemic. I'm really happy to welcome you all to our C3S book conversation. This is some sort of a second book conversation for this week, actually, because the previous one was Dr. Zeno Leone from King's College London, who spoke on his book American Grand Strategy: From Obama to Trump, Imperialism After Bush and China's Hegemonic Challenge. To speak on this topic today, we are happy to have with us Mr. Dexter Roberts, who is joining from the US, who will be speaking on his book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. Thank you, Mr. Roberts, for accepting our invitation and taking your time out to be with us today. Before going further into the book, I would like to introduce our moderator for today, Mr. Sri M.R. Sivaraman, IAS retired, who has served in the Union government as Revenue Secretary. He has 40 years of experience and distinguished service where he has served in several capacities, like he has held important positions at various levels in the Department of Finance, Planning, Finance Commission, Economic Affairs, and Ministry of Commerce and Finance. He has also worked as Executive Director, International Monetary Fund, and was an expert advisor to the United Nations Security Council Committee to Counter Terrorism. Thank you very much, Shivraman sir, for accepting our invitation and moderate and steer this session.
Thank you.
Just to give a glimpse of the book, in The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, Mr. Roberts explores the reality behind the today's financially ascendant China, and he also pulls the curtain back on how the Chinese manufacturing machine is actually powered. China's dramatic political and economic rise over the past 3 decades has been well recorded, but there are certain lesser known aspects, like the effort of China's rural laborers, migrants, which have been who have largely enriched the coastal elites, instead of creating the egalitarian capitalist society which China claims and espouses. So in a way, Dexter Roberts' book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, takes us deep into the story of China's rise, and it exposes this reality. And Mr. Roberts also very succinctly chronicles the lives of many rural folks he has met during the 2 decades of work and travels in China. So in a way, this book gives a very personal and compassionate touch with the authenticity of Mr. Roberts, who has got a hands-on China as an expert during his travels. Just to give you a brief introduction of the speaker we have with us, Mr. Dexter Roberts. He is an award-winning writer and speaker on China now, serving as senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Asia Security Initiative, a fellow at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, and an adjunct instructor in political science at the University of Montana. Previously, Mr. Roberts was with China Bureau Chief and Asia News Editor at Bloomberg Business Week, based in Beijing, for more than 2 decades. He has reported from all of China's provinces and regions, including Tibet and Xinjiang, covering the rise of companies and entrepreneurs, manufacturing, migrants, demography, and civil society, including politics and security. He has also reported from North Korea, Mongolia, and Cambodia on China's growing economic and political influence. This is Mr. Roberts' first book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, The Worker, the Factory, and the Future of the World, which was published by St. Martin's Press in March 2020. He also founded and publishes a weekly newsletter called Trade War. He holds a BA in Political Science from Stanford University and Master of International Relations from Columbia University, and studied Mandarin Chinese at Taiwan Normal University. On this note, I would like to hand it over to Sri M.R. Shivaraman, who will briefly introduce a topic, later which we'll move on to the presentation of Mr. Roberts. Over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Once again, welcome to you, Dr. Roberts, and good evening to you. Good morning to everybody. And I hope all of you are safe, because the pandemic seems to be almost on a rampage in India. The title of your book is very enticing, and the content seems to be really fascinating. Unfortunately, I have not been able to get a copy of your book, which I would get very soon through Amazon, because the deliveries are not very sure here. One other thing which somewhat surprised me was, in the context of some figures that I have noticed about China, how does your title, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, really correspond with the figures that I have seen? China has attracted so far $1.77 trillion of foreign direct investment, of which $116 billion till 2019 was from the United States. Secondly, all the countries in the world, excepting 5 or 6, have trade deficit with China. Between the years 2015 and 20, China had a trade deficit of $3.2 trillion with the United States and the European Union. Surprisingly, in the last 2 months, even after the outbreak of, or rather the serious steps taken by Trump, the export surplus which China has had with the United States in the last 2 months has been 30%, 34% more than that of last year. How does it correspond? These figures, how does it correspond with the with Chinese capitalism? The second point that I want to say here is the classic way in which China built up its economy. The 3 stages of growth, whether they had passed through an agricultural stage, I do not know. But they somehow saw to it that the surplus labor in agriculture got transferred to cheap labor from Chinese agriculture sector in industries. And with that, the opening of United States gave them an opportunity to make an assault on the domestic economies of the States by flooding their markets with cheap goods, by exploiting their labor. And I'm sure you have dealt with it in a very serious manner in your book, and you will explain it to us. What is the present condition of labor in China? Do they have any labor unions? If they have any, how does the government regulate them, or how do they control them? And what is the divide between rural and urban wages as far as labor is concerned? The next point is agriculture free in China? Because we are not able to find out definitively, at least I have not been able to find out from various books. I have one lying right in front of me, the recent book on history of China. I have not been able to find out from it whether the farmers in China have rights to land, rights of ownership to the land. As we have in India, you have a parcel of land, you are the owner to it, you can give it to your successors, you can sell it, you can destroy it, you can do whatever you want. Do these rights exist in China as far as the farm sector is concerned? Now, one thing which is which I have noticed in China is that why industries rush towards China? Because they have no problem of land acquisition. The entire land in China is owned by the states, the provinces, or by Chinese government. So if they want land, they are given. If the land is under somebody's occupation, it is given to them, but not so in India. It's not at all possible to get land in India so easily and liberally. So do you think that this kind of availability of land, when they ask for and where it is asked for, is something which has given China an edge over other developing countries? How do you relate the title of your book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, to the future of the world? The myth of Chinese capitalism really relate to the future of the world. I know, because I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation that only 5 or 6 countries have got trade surplus with China. So maybe something that happens in China may affect the future of the world. We will be very grateful to know it from you. If China wants globalization, that's what repeatedly Mr. Z has been saying everywhere. Why is it investing so much in its armed forces? It's almost close to $1 trillion that they are investing in their armed forces. As far as I can see, there is no chance of seaborne assault on mainland China, either by the United States of America or by Japan, the 2 countries which are capable of and which also did in the past. They are unlikely to do it. Secondly, all the Southeast Asian countries neighboring China are too small for China to bother about it, because if they want to walk over, they can walk over anytime. And most of them are having a large number of ethnic Chinese who are builders of those countries in the past and who are still building them there. So why is it China is building a huge army? I can see only one aim of China, that is to fight India again, or at least to take over the 5 fingers, as Mao described it, of Nepal, Ladakh, Sikkim, Arunachal, and Bhutan. But Chinese have now learned that it may not be very easy. And even if they try to do it, it will be extraordinarily costly to them. Then there's one more question that I have to ask you. What happened to those 303 people who signed the Charter 08? I'm sure you know about the Charter 08, which was presented, which was published in China on 10th December 2008, on the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where they laid down 19 charter of demands, which probably one can see in very developed countries or to a large extent in India also. Of course, one of them and he was given the Nobel Prize, that is Lin Xiaobo. What happened to the others? Is there anything in China or anybody in China who still talks about this Charter 08? Thank you, Mr. Roberts. I hope I have given you quite a substantial number of questions to be answered. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, well, there's a lot there, all very good questions. I think what I should do is probably first talk a bit about the title, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, which I think is a good way to start this our discussion today. The issues of the labor situation in the unions and the farmers' rights to the land. I think I will actually touch on those in the course of my presentation. So maybe we could start with the question of the myth of Chinese capitalism. Charter 08, that's sort of a separate question. This is not something that people are allowed to talk about in China today. If you were to try to speak openly or have a talk about it, probably all the members of your seminar discussing Charter 08 would end up in jail. A bold effort that has been as part of a larger crackdown on civil society and political rights has been really squashed. Charter 08 is not something that you can talk about inside China. We can talk about it here, outside of China. But let me start with the myth of Chinese capitalism. I think that's a good question. By the myth of Chinese capitalism, the title of my book, I'm actually referring to a number of different myths. And capitalism in this case, in the context of my book, is really another way of saying economic reform. And what we've seen in China is starting back in 1978, 1979 with Deng Xiaoping and reform and opening, a tremendously positive story of reform, or if you will, of Chinese capitalism developing as the economy opened up after the very, very insular Mao era. Why do I say a myth of Chinese capitalism now? It is because I argue in my book, and I'll argue here today, that really since at least 2012, which, as I think many of you will realize, coincides with the ascension of a new leader in China, General Secretary Xi Jinping, we have seen a marked slowdown in economic reform. China has moved in a quite dramatic fashion away from an economic strategy based on continual opening to the world, best exemplified by probably by the era around its entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, to one that is much more focused on trying to build up its internal strengths, rely on its own market, and gradually move away from such a reliance on the world. Another of the myths I talk about in my book is the myth that the Chinese, so the first myth is a myth that reform will inexorably continue in China for on and on, and that will continue to create opportunities for companies and countries around the world. I think we've seen, and a lot of people, a lot of companies and countries are starting to wake up to the fact that that is not the case. China, for a number of years, is reforming its economy, reforming itself completely on its own terms, moving away from this idea of a Chinese capitalism. The other big myth is that China will continue to almost magically create a larger and larger middle class. And this is a big one that has really been what many a global multinational has built its economic fortunes on, or its economic future on, the assumption that China will continue to mint ever more large numbers of middle class, and they will become part of its future market. And as I will talk about in a minute, as I go through my book, that is not the case anymore. China is coming up against the fact that close to 1/2 of its population is not being fully integrated into the economy. That is rural people. You were asking about farmers' rights to the land. I'll talk a little bit later about the incomplete nature of farmers' rights to the land in China. It's very incomplete. And that means that the second myth of my title is that China will continue to grow. It's already very substantial and large middle class on in perpetuity, bringing more people into the middle class. As I will argue in the book presentation, that is no longer the case in China. What I'd like to do now, I think would be best, would to actually be to jump into my slideshow, and I hope that during that slideshow I can continue and I will continue to answer your very good questions during that period. So is it possible to pull that up now on the screen?
Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay. So as you know, as was mentioned in the kind introduction, my book, The Myth of Chinese Capitalism, it came out last year. What I'd like to do to start is to talk about the origins of how I came to write this book. In order to do so, I have to take all of you back quite a few years to the year 2000. At that point, I had actually been in China for 5 years. I came in 1995 for Business Week magazine before it became part of Bloomberg. And for those first 5 years in China, I had been very much focused on writing and reporting the story of urban China, the big cities, and also, of course, as a reporter for Business Week magazine, focusing on the opportunities and the travails of big multinationals, and particularly American companies as they came into China, and again, primarily focused on trying to tap into the big city markets of China. In that year, next slide, please. Could we progress one slide?
Yeah, I've changed it to the next slide. Is it?
Okay. So when the next slide.
The next slide. Bala, we've not seen the next slide. We'll have to advance. They're still on the slide 1.
Okay, I'll just reshare it again because
There we have it now. So in the year 2000, as I mentioned, the early origins of how I came to write this book. For the first time in 2000, I left the big cities and I went to a then quite remote and poor part of China, a province called Guizhou province, which unfortunately is still relatively remote and poor. And I was working on 2 cover stories for Business Week, and you can see here the main part of the slide is one of those covers, which was the Great Migration. I was looking for that cover story for Business Week at the phenomena then just starting to really take off of huge numbers, even back then, a couple 100 million people who were leaving the rural parts of China and the poorer parts, such as Guizhou province, and going to the cities, then to mainly find work in factories and on construction sites. If you can see on the left side of the slide, you can see the previous slide that we missed is another cover story that I did that same year called China's Wealth Gap. I think you can see that on the left, the left upper corner. That story also took me to Guizhou province again for the second time in that year, 2000. I was looking then at, as the cover suggests, China's already large wealth gap. At this point, we were already a number of decades into reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping, which, as you know, was launched in the 1979. And one of the one of the offshoots of reform under Deng Xiaoping was growing inequality or a growing wealth gap. Now, this was not a surprise to the leadership. You may remember that Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader himself, said, some will get rich first. So he was very aware in his idea of his version of economic reform, sort of a Chinese version of trickle-down economics, that some people would get rich first. And those people quite naturally were the people living in coastal China, in the provinces that were most able to trade with the world, which throughout history had always been wealthier than Western interior provinces like Guizhou. But by the year 2000, despite the fact that the leadership had been aware that inequality would come with economic growth, they were starting to get a bit worried about it. So back then we had a much earlier leader, General Secretary Jiang Zemin, and he, in 1999, a year before I went to Guizhou, launched a policy called Develop the West. That policy specifically aimed, as its title suggests, to develop the Western and poorer parts of China and start to deal with this growing wealth gap that was coming with economic prosperity along the coastal parts of China. On both those trips, one to look at the wealth gap in Guizhou, the other to look at the huge force of migrants that were starting to travel to the countries, travel from the countryside to the cities in order to find better incomes away from the poor interior. In both those cases, I spoke to a number of officials in Guizhou and other parts of China. And one of the statistics or the numbers that I kept being told as a demonstration of the gap that needed to be overcome was the fact that your average rural person in China was earning about a third as much as your average urban person. So I was told that this was something that the Develop the West program under Jiang Zemin would help to eventually redress. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Yes, I'll just try to present it again so that it comes in a presentation mode.
So this is the same one. So if you could progress one.
Yeah, this one, the Guangdong and Guizhou, the factory and village.
No, what we are seeing only the previous slide.
So
I'm seeing the factory and the village slide. Is it?
No,
No, we're not seeing it. Yeah, that's
okay. Here we are. It's just come up.
we saw that now. It went off the screen now.
It was there momentarily. So while it's coming up, I'll keep going here. So, here we go. So if you look at this slide, this will show, again, in these two cover stories, I had visited actually a quite remote part of Guizhou province, already a pretty remote part of China. And the place I went to was a small village called Binghua or Binghua Cun, which happens to be in the southeast corner of Guizhou, not far from another province called Guangxi. This village was a place where I was to meet a bunch of young people, all of which were migrants, who the vast majority of young people from this village had all ended up in Dongguan province. In Dongguan city in Guangdong province, down not far away from Hong Kong. And so these two places, Dongguan, which we can see the picture on the factory picture on the left is near Dongguan, just up the river, up the Pearl River Delta from Dongguan. And on the right, the village of Binghua Cun, which is where the young migrants were leaving, became places that I was to return to again and again over the next 20 years, going to both places dozens of times. In my book, I ended up focusing in on these two regions, or these two places, Dongguan and Guangdong, the factory town, probably the best known factory town in the world, producing probably more goods for the world than any other city in the world, any other city in China or the world. And this little remote village, quite poor in Guizhou. So if we could try for the next slide.
Does it come up? No, I'm seeing more Rubo.
I think it's just slow. It's not there yet.
It's still on the factory. Bala, you have to advance it one. Go down.
I did, sir.
Well, now it's come up.
Okay, now we have it. So the young gentleman here, I think he was 20 years old when I met him, Mo Rubo, was from this village in Guizhou. He was one of the first young people to leave the village and seek work along the coast. By the time I met him, again, I think he was 20 years old. He was working as a welder in an electronics factory owned by a Taiwanese businessman in Dongguan. He had already been had left Guizhou, left his village for about 5 years. He'd worked in Shanghai for a while. He'd worked in a place called Ningbo, not far from Shanghai. And then had worked in a number of different factories in Guangdong province. When I met him here in an electronics factory. So Mo Rubo was one of the people that, again, I first met in 2000. And when all of you do have a chance to read my book, you will see is a person that I got to know very well. And throughout my book, I do follow the course of his life since we first met, almost more than 2 decades ago. Next slide.
Has it come up?
There, we've got it. Okay, so this is a picture. This is a typical city scene from this factory town of Dongguan. That is Mo Rubo, here pictured with his then girlfriend, also a migrant worker in the same factory as him, but from a very different part of China. She's from Henan province, also quite poor, but much further north than Guizhou, and a very agricultural province. So this is when they first met. Next slide. The young woman you can see here in the red jacket, Mo Meiquan, is another person that, again, I met both in Dongguan, where she was working in a factory, and then later in the year when I made it to Binghuacun, the village in Guizhou, she happened to be back in the village. And the reason she was back was twofold. One reason was to help her parents with the rice harvest. So help with them, they're subsistence farmers in the village, and she had come back to help them with that. But more importantly for her, she had come back to renew her identity card. At this time, it could be very, very risky for migrant workers in China to be in the cities, away from their home, with an expired identity card. And just to give you a sense of the precarious nature of migrant workers then in China, Mei Chuan's distant cousin, who had also moved to Dongguan, had been picked up by the local police several months before I met her. And because his identity card had been expired, he was thrown in what they used to call a black jail in China. At this time, migrants were seen really as an easy source of income for local police officers. They would pick them up on an infraction like an expired identity card or not carrying their identity card, which was rather common because often the factory managers would take their identity cards when they started to work there to try to have a little bit of leverage over them. So also they would often be out on the streets without their identity cards. Anyway, her cousin was picked up, was held in one of these incarceration centers for migrant workers, and basically was held hostage until he could raise enough money. In his case, it was several months of income to pay off the local police. The police claimed that they were just fining him for having an expired identity card, but in reality, it was really a shakedown. And this was very, very common. In the year 2000, when I first started to talk a lot to migrant workers, again and again, I would hear about how hostile the local security forces and the police were to them, and how vulnerable they were in these cities that they came to work at, and how they could again be picked up for all sorts of infractions by the local police. So she was back again, helping her parents with the harvest, but at the same time, very important, getting her identity card renewed. This visit I went to Guizhou twice. The second time I ended up visiting the village Binghuacun. This first time I visited Binghuacun, there was something that everybody was talking about in the village, and this might come as a bit of a surprise. Next slide, please. But they were talking about China's imminent entry to the World Trade Organization. You can see here another cover story that I worked on at the time that came out when China entered the World Trade Organization. So I'm visiting this village in Guizhou in late 2000. China's not going to enter the World Trade Organization until the end of 2001, about a year later. But at this point, China and the US had recently signed their bilateral accession agreement, throwing open their markets to each other, slashing tariffs, very much a different approach from what we've seen under the Trump administration, when it's all been about competitively slapping tariffs on each other. In this case, the US and China had signed this bilateral agreement, opening their markets to each other. And the US-China bilateral agreement was the most important bilateral that China had to sign. So at this point, everybody knew that China was about to enter the World Trade Organization. They even knew that it would likely be at the end of 2001. So here in this little remote village, very poor, mainly focused just on subsistence agriculture, I sat down with the village the village chief, and this man who had very little education, knew all about China's imminent entry to the World Trade Organization. As a matter of fact, the reason why they were eager to talk to me that first time was because they thought that perhaps being featured in a global business magazine or an American business magazine might actually help to bring investment to their little village. And they were being told, like villagers across China, that WTO would bring new opportunities to the hinterlands of China. In the case of Binghuacun, the hope was that they would get some investors to come that actually would help them set up a processing factory. So they wanted to set up a vegetable and fruit processing factory, which would allow them to move beyond just subsistence agriculture and actually move up to some value-added production, and also provide potential employment for their young people. So the young people would not all have to flee the countryside and go to the factories and the construction sites along the coast. So this, as I say in the slide here, the dimensions of how the World Trade Organization, China's entry to the World Trade Organization transformed its economy are now obvious to us all. As it set off a surge in foreign investment into China, which led to the opening of thousands and thousands of factories. China began its rise to what it is today. One of the two largest world traders, an economy that is on track, many believe, to surpass the U.S. within a number of years. Next slide, please. So this picture here is actually not far from that same village of Binghua. This is a picture I took, I think, in 2018, shortly before I moved back to the United States. And what you can see here is one of the very, very phenomenal achievements that the leadership of China has achieved in all those years since entry to the World Trade Organization. Here, of course, we're looking at infrastructure. I think it's pretty much, we all now know that China has been, in many ways, a tremendous success when it comes to building out its infrastructure. We all know about the high-speed rail, the world's largest network of high-speed rail, and similarly, these amazing expressways that now link even the most remote parts of China, including Guizhou province, with the coast. You can see here one of those expressways, and if you look very carefully, you can see a billboard down there. It's too small to actually read the characters, but the fact that it is red and gold is a hint for us. That means it's Communist Party propaganda. I believe it was a billboard that had one of Xi Jinping's socialist slogans on it, which are, just like the infrastructure, have spread throughout the country, even to the remotest parts of China. So this year, 2021, is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. They will celebrate the 100th birthday of the Communist Party on July 1st. They have set a number of centennial or 100-year goals, which they have aimed, and in some cases they have already achieved, to coincide with 100 years of the Chinese Communist Party. One of those goals, which they recently announced that they had completed, was the ending of absolute poverty or extreme poverty in China. So just in the last few months, they've announced that there is no longer extreme poverty in China, and that is a tremendously impressive goal. They also announced that between the years 2010 and 2020, they would double average per capita incomes, and they would also double the size of the GDP. And they have accomplished both of those goals, even in the face of COVID-19 and the downturn, the global downturn that we saw, particularly last year. So the achievements that the Chinese Communist Party, which is the leadership of China, has achieved over all these years that I was reporting there, and since they entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, are undeniable and absolutely impressive. They have lifted living standards across the country, and that is true not just in the coasts anymore, but in the interior of China as well. But I'd like to return to a number that I highlighted earlier, and that was the fact that, if you will recall, back in 2000, I kept being told by local officials, we need to overcome this rural-urban gap, which is about 3 to 1 in terms of average incomes. Well, all these efforts, develop the West, the massive infrastructure rollout, entry to the World Trade Organization, that gap is still roughly 3 to 1. So their expressed goal of ending that gap did not succeed. Much more importantly, we are seeing today in China a society, an economy that is deeply riven with inequality. China has a large and growing income gap and an even larger and faster growing wealth gap. And something that might come as a surprise to some people, China actually now has one of the most unequal societies and economies in the world. Thomas Piketty, the noted inequality expert who wrote Capital in the 21st century, he has done research in China, And he and his co-researcher, a gentleman named Gabriel Zuckman from Berkeley in the United States, Berkeley, California, found that China and Russia's wealth gap is roughly the same. Russia's a little more extreme. And that, more alarmingly, that wealth gap is growing equally fast in both of these countries. So China now is one of the most unequal countries and societies in the world. So one of the key questions that I look at in my book is, how can that be? Why? It's certainly not something that the Chinese government is comfortable with, or the Chinese Communist Party. They talk all the time about trying to limit the wealth gap. And as I said a moment ago, one of their highest priorities has been to end absolute poverty, in one of their most highest priorities in recent years. So how is it that there is still such a large wealth gap, and indeed that there is a growing wealth gap that is far, far worse than it was back in 2000, when I first started writing about inequality in China? So please, to the next slide. So I focus in my research recently and in my book on two legacy policies that actually date back to the era of Mao Zedong. And the first of these policies is, you can see a picture of it here, of the actual physical manifestation of this policy, which is called the household registration, or in Chinese, the hukou policy. This was instituted in the mid-50s, 1953, I believe, or early 50s, by Mao Zedong. And he, as was often the case back then, turned to the then Soviet Union and Stalin to take his cue on economic policy making. And the then Soviet Union had an internal passport system, I believe, called the Propiska. And China, although it had a form of household registration going back centuries, really created its modern household registration system by borrowing some elements from the Soviets. So what was the household registration policy back then? It was an effort by Mao to ensure that the country of China would industrialize rapidly. And in order to industrialize rapidly, he thought, and I think he was probably right, that they needed cheap, affordable food to supply the cities and to feed the technocrats and the engineers who would carry out industrialization. In order to do so, they wanted to have a large, pliable population in rural China, then later housed and employed in the commune system that would produce cheap food and in effect subsidize urban China and industrialization. So the household registration policy made it near impossible for rural people to move from rural China and go to the cities, as they might have naturally done without this policy. So today, obviously, that restriction of the hukou policy, or the household registration policy on mobility, is no longer there. I've been talking about the fact that we have some 300 million migrants in China that have traveled from the countryside to the cities. So that the hukou no longer restricts the movement of people, but it is still alive and well in modern day China. The household registration is still a part of every person's life. And what it does still today, and this is where it starts to have an impact on the wealth of some 1/2 of the population, it restricts the ability, or it ties the ability of people's access to social welfare programs, including healthcare, and also access to schools for their children, to the place where they, or actually where their parents were born. So what the household registration policy does today is, in effect, makes it very, very difficult for these rural migrants, when they come to the cities, to access affordable health care there in the cities. And it makes it virtually impossible for them to bring their children with them, because they cannot put them into urban public schools. They're not allowed in because they don't have the right household registration. The medical care and the education instead should be satisfied back in the countryside. So the migrants, in theory, should return to the countryside to get the proper health care, and certainly that's where their children should go to school. This has been had an enormous effect on the incomes of the migrants of China. Again, numbering some 300 million people. It means, in effect, that they, in many cases, will engage in what economists call precautionary savings. They will save a large portion of the money they earn, in effect, for a rainy day. Because of their difficulty in accessing urban health care, they are vulnerable to medical emergencies or illnesses that can be devastating for the incomes of a migrant worker's household. So they will not spend as much money because they need to be ready if indeed they're in a situation where they do need to secure immediate medical care. It can be very expensive. Similarly, they need to often save money for their children. There are next slide, please. So what has happened to most of these migrant children? Well, it's not only the hukou policy has not only become an economic constraint on these families, but it also really creates a human rights situation. And that is the fact that because of this policy, the vast majority of the children of migrant workers grow up separate from their parents. Because it is so difficult for them to access affordable education in the cities, in most cases, they are sent back to study in the countryside. They used to be in rundown village schools. The Chinese government, to its credit, thought that that was not a good situation. And a lot of money has been plowed into making very large boarding schools. These boarding schools often have quite impressive physical infrastructure. You can see a picture of one here behind this little boy. They often will even have athletic facilities and so on. But what they don't typically have is very good education or very good teachers. They are also a source of psychological distress for many of these migrant children who, again, are growing up away from their parents. In most cases, they would see their parents probably once a year during the Lunar New Year when their parents come back from the cities to see their families. Because of the psychological distress, because of the poor education in these schools, today we have a situation in China where rural children drop out of schools at a far, far higher rate than urban kids or those with urban hukous or household registration. I should note that we're talking about a very substantial group of people. The term that Chinese have come up with to describe this phenomena of children who are in a situation where they have to grow up away from their parents is left behind children. And according to who you speak to, estimates range as high as 100 million of these youth who end up growing up away from their parents. Next slide. Okay, so now we're returning to one of the very good questions asked at the beginning, and that is rural land. The other legacy policy that has an enormous impact on the lives of both rural Chinese, but also on migrant workers, who typically will still have a small plot of land that they have the right to till back in the countryside, even when they're working in far off cities or on construction sites. And this policy is called the dual land policy. Again, it's a legacy policy because it has aspects that are unchanged going all the way back to the Mao era. What the dual land policy means, in effect, is whereas urban Chinese, people with urban household registration or hukou, whereas they are able to buy and sell, in effect, the apartments that they own, and have done so with great gusto, and helped create a massive rise in wealth in China. Whereas they're able to do that. In most cases, it is extremely difficult for the rural people or the migrants to actually buy or sell, or really even practically monetize the land that that they hold back in the countryside. This is because technically all rural land in China is still officially designated as belonging to the collective. This is a throwback to the collective and the commune era. And that means that it isn't easy to sell it at all for the migrants or the rural people. That doesn't mean that there aren't people, or officials rather, that are becoming very wealthy buying and selling rural land. It's just not the farmers and the migrants. Indeed, we are now in a situation in China where a major source of local government income now, up to in some estimates, up to half of the revenues of some of the local townships in China are derived from buying and selling land. So how do they do that? As local officials, they have the ability to, in effect, rezone the land from agricultural uses to commercial or industrial uses. And then typically what they would do is they would pay a very nominal fee to the farmer or the migrant worker for the land, and then rezone it and sell it at values multiples and multiples higher onto property developers, onto factory owners, onto, whether it's residential or commercial malls or residential high rises. And so this has become a source of wealth for local governments, but not for the local people in the countryside. So this dual land system, probably more than anything else, explains why we have seen such a rapid rise in the wealth gap in China. Whereas the people in urban China with urban household registration have been able to make vast sums of money buying and selling their apartments, this has not been the case at all for rural Chinese. Next slide, please. So this is actually another picture with, this is Mo Rubo, the young man, was a young man earlier in the picture in 2000. He was the young guy welding in the factory, Mo Rubo. The woman with him was the young woman on the street with him, who I mentioned was a migrant worker from Henan, was his girlfriend then. Well, now they are a married couple, and the other person is their 5-year-old daughter. Mo Rubo and his wife are somewhat unusual in that even as they have left behind factory work, they have not tried to return to the countryside to try to find work there. And they have not gone into the service industry, which has become a major employer of migrants in urban China. But instead, he and his wife are small entrepreneurs. They were running a online athletic apparel business where they would source athletic apparel from factories. They wouldn't produce it themselves, and they have their own little brand that even most Chinese have never heard of, a very small athletic apparel brand, and they would sell these clothes online. A very tough business. When I met them, and this was I think in 2018, they were renting a small apartment, not actually far from the factory that they had worked in 2000 when I first met them. And that small apartment was both their home with their daughter, although tight, and also their home office. The prospect of actually buying an apartment in urban China, in Dongguan, where they still live, was completely out of the realm of possibility given the costs. The issue that they were struggling with when I saw them on this day was what they were going to do for their daughter's education. She was, as I said, 5 years old, and Mo Rubo told me he was determined to ensure that she would not become a left behind child. So he was not going to send her back to Guizhou province, where she could get into a boarding school for a free boarding school, but instead he was going to try to get her into one of these small private schools that have sprung up in many parts of urban China that cater specifically to migrant workers' children. These private schools not only are often of not very good quality, but they're actually quite expensive. So he and his wife were struggling with figuring out how they were going to afford a private school in Dongguan, one of these private schools for migrant kids. I spoke to him recently, about 2 weeks ago. His daughter is in a private school. It hasn't been easy for them, but they have kept to their determination to not send her back and have her live away from them. So my book, as was mentioned earlier, came out March 10th, last year. I was in New York for the book launch. March was right about the time that people in the United States started to recognize that we had a severe problem with COVID-19. And so I actually cut short my book tour to New York City because of COVID-19. So as you will not be surprised to hear that nowhere in my book do I mention the pandemic or COVID-19. I do have a Chinese edition of my book that just came out about 2 weeks ago. And I wrote a new chapter for that, which does talk about COVID-19 and the effect that it's had on China, and particularly on this more vulnerable population of China, the migrant workers in rural China, but not in my book, my English book. So again, nowhere in my book do I mention the pandemic. However, I do think that the events of the last year in many ways have made the dilemma that's facing the leadership in China today even more stark. And so what is that dilemma? Long before the pandemic, even before the trade war started to wake up Chinese leaders to the fact that it wasn't such a good idea to be so reliant on the rest of the world for growth, China's leaders were already talking about the need to move towards a much more domestic-oriented economy. They have been talking about it at least since 2013, when they had a key economic meeting of the Communist Party, the third plenum. And so there has been this awareness in China, which has only been brought home more so by the trade war and now by the pandemic, that China really needs to move away from its old model of a factory to the world, producing cheap goods, largely reliant on trade, that had served it so well in the reform era to date. But what we're seeing today is, again, new challenges overseas. China did do very well with exports last year, as was mentioned earlier, but much of that was related to electronics goods, related to people working from home, also PPE equipment related to people protecting themselves from COVID-19. But it's not clear that this surge in exports that we saw last year will be sustainable a long time. And most importantly, the leadership of China does not believe it will be sustainable a long time. So what we've heard recently in China is the launch of a new policy they call the dual circulation policy. And they call it dual circulation. It's dual, there's two parts to it, in a nod to the fact that they know that China will continue to be a very important trading nation. But the emphasis that they now have made increasingly clear is that they will rely far more on the spending power of their own people, on their own technology produced indigenously, rather than buying semiconductor chips, for example, from the high-end semiconductor chips from the rest of the world. So there's this awareness in China that they need to move to a much more domestic-oriented economy. As they already know, they face a challenge there. Another economic statistic I want to throw out. If you look at household consumption as a proportion of GDP in China today, it is still stuck under 40%. This is very low, lower than India, lower than the US, lower than most countries, developing countries as well around the world. So they are not relying on the spending power of their own people to the degree to which they would like to. They are also concerned, as I mentioned earlier, about the reliability of being a major exporter. The trade war waged by Trump brought that home to them. The attempts by the US government to undermine China's biggest technology companies, including Huawei and others, also brought home to them the need to be more self-sufficient. So we're hearing again today in China more and more, another Mao era expression, self-reliance. In Chinese, they say 自力更生. Xi Jinping talks a lot about the need for self-reliance today. But this is where they run into the problem of their legacy policies. As I mentioned earlier, both the household registration policy and the dual land policy, in effect, are restricting the ability of some 1/2 of China's people. And if you add together the migrant workers plus their relatives in the countryside, it does amount to 500 or 600 million people, close to half of China's population. And that group are not becoming the spenders and helping to boost household consumption to the degree that the Chinese government would like to see. I'll just end before we move to questions, which should be probably even more interesting than me talking. I should note that China's leaders have been aware that both these policies I mentioned, the household registration policy and the dual land policy, are obstacles to creating a more consumption-driven economy. They have been talking again since this important economic meeting in 2013 about the need to reform and eventually do away with these policies. The sad fact is, despite a lot of talk, they have made very little progress. And in some ways, we've actually seen a backsliding. And this is something we've seen during the pandemic. There's been a growing resistance in urban China to migrant workers coming and making their lives and finding work there, perhaps because of this perception that they could bring COVID with them, although there's no suggestion that has been an area of transmission through the migrant workers. So one last point, we saw, as everyone knows, rather tremendous growth in China last year after a disastrous first quarter. China, mainly because it was able to bring the pandemic under control, was able to restart the economy. And we saw in the first quarter of this year, I think they announced something like 18.6% GDP growth over the same quarter the previous year. But what I'd like to point out, and again, the Chinese officials and policymakers are aware of this, despite that very, very impressive growth number, if you look a little more deeply, there are real problems there. First of all, if you look at quarter-over-quarter growth, so the first quarter of this year, as the growth as compared to the last quarter of last year, the growth was only, I think, 0.6%. That is the slowest growth that China has experienced, other than the first quarter of last year during the height of the pandemic. If you take that one quarter out, which was very bad, this is the slowest quarter-on-quarter growth China's experienced in 20 years. We've also seen throughout the course of the pandemic a backsliding, if you will, in China's efforts to deal with some of the challenges in the economy. One big one they've been trying to work on very diligently is deleveraging, or reducing the reliance of the economy on debt. According to most estimates, China's overall debt level now exceeds 300% of GDP. And this is a level that has many policymakers in China worried about as being potentially destabilizing. Well, we saw one of the costs of ensuring that growth kept up during the very difficult last year was loosening again the spending spigots, and debt began to build up again. We also saw, unfortunately, household consumption or average consumption per capita fall last year. So they actually are moving in the wrong direction when it comes to rebalancing away from a debt-driven, investment-driven economy towards a more domestic consumption-driven economy. Anyway, so I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for that very interesting and enlightening presentation. And with that, we'll move on to the question and answer session. I request all the participants to post your questions in the chat box, and I'll read it out to Dr. Roberts, and he'll very kindly answer them. With that, we'll move on to the first question. It's from our director, Commodore Vasanta, and he asks, with the authoritarian regime, China has managed to convey a message that its model is very good for alleviation of poverty and societal improvements. Having lived in China for decades, how do you see the people's responses to this false narrative?
So I think, I mean, there's two things here. One thing, as I mentioned earlier, that even as they have made real progress on ending extreme poverty, we've seen an explosion in wealth inequality. And they are aware of that. And they are starting now to pivot to talk about how they can deal with the growing inequality now that they have solved some of the extreme poverty. One concern I have about their poverty alleviation program is it's been deeply reliant on population transfers, in some cases forced population transfers. They've moved literally tens of millions of people out of areas that they see in China as not good for economic growth into newly created cities. One of the issues, and I visited a number of these resettlement cities, one of the issues I think is what will be the source of economic growth in these newly created communities that often house former subsistence farmers who don't necessarily have the training to be part of a new service economy. So this is a big concern. In many cases, the resettled former poverty-stricken people are surviving on government spending now. And if that were to end someday, I hope it doesn't, I think we could see some of them potentially even slide back into poverty once again. I think in terms of the perception of most Chinese people, certainly of urban Chinese people that are not part of the group of people that were in poverty, I think there's, I think that in most cases they believe what they're being told by the government. They see it as a source of pride that China has lifted people out of poverty, as they put it. So I don't think that they necessarily have a deep understanding of some of the potential challenges ahead with this massive program. If you talk to migrant workers, which I spent many years doing in China, you get a bit of a different perspective. I believe there's a growing awareness amongst many of them about how the system functions in a way that discriminates against them in terms of access to healthcare and education, makes it more difficult for them to settle permanently in the cities. And that is something that I think we're seeing a growing awareness amongst migrant workers, just how that happens, how that's connected to the household registration policy, and in some cases, growing resentment about that.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. We'll move on to the next question, and it's from our research intern, Dhyanyashri. She asks, recently, Xi Jinping declared that China has scored a complete victory in its fight against poverty by lifting over 770 million people out of it in the last 4 decades. On the other hand, like you mentioned, China will continue to largely have an increase in its middle class. What are your comments on the rat tribes living in Beijing? Is it a product of the socialist capitalism of China, which created a new economic class?
So the last part was, could you just rephrase the last part, please? is what a function of that?
She's asking about the rat tribes living in Beijing. She asks, is it a product of the socialist capitalism of China, which created a new economic class?
The ant tribes, is that what she said? The
rat tribes, R-A-T, rat tribes.
I do not know the expression rat tribes. One of the expressions that's similar that they talk to is the ant tribe or the ant groups, which are typically migrants who don't earn much income, who live in very dense housing complexes on the outskirts of big cities like Beijing. And that indeed is a function of economic development in China, but also of the continuing power of the household registration system, which means that they very much feel like temporary guests in the city, where they come to work fully aware that when there's no longer a job, or when they get older, they're going to have to leave. And if they don't leave themselves, the authorities will make sure that they leave. You see a situation in the big showcase cities like Beijing and Shanghai, where they've actually set growth population targets of reduction. So they are deliberately trying to reduce the population in these cities. And they're able to do that in large part through utilizing this household registration system. And then more heavy-handed tactics, where they will expel migrants from these dense apartments that they live in on the outskirts of the city. So yeah, I think this is a function both of larger economic development, but also of the continuing power of the household registration system.
Right, thank you for that. The next comment we have is from our director, Vasan sir, and I'll follow that up with another question from sir. He says, this is just an extension of what was achieved by the so-called Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward that left millions dead or purged to retain communism and the special characteristics of the CCP. And to follow that up with sir's next question, he says, you spoke about left behind children. What about the left behind women who are so described? How has this impacted the society?
So there are left behind women, but China is also a country that has, for better or for worse, has its economy, its factory owners have sought out women workers. In the earlier days in the textile industry, when it was still very strong in China, the vast majority of the workers on the factory lines were women. And there was a perception, you would talk to your average Hong Kong or Taiwanese factory owner, and they would always say, we want women working in the factories. They don't protest as much, and they are good. They're good in the factories. They work hard. So there are plenty of women who are working in the cities. One phenomenon you do see is when women become pregnant, they will often go back to the villages for a period of time to be with their parents in some cases. Also, as I said earlier, to get access to medical care that would not be available in the cities for the childbirth. So that is one situation. Another, stepping one step further than that question, another left behind group, which is a very big issue in China, is the left behind elderly. And for the same reasons that the access to healthcare and the restrictions in the cities, in most cases, elderly parents will not accompany their more youthful children who go to seek work in the factories. You have a situation today in China where there is still some very severe problems with poverty amongst elderly people. This is something that, again, has to do with the household registration policy.
Right. The next question is from Mr. Balasubramaniam, and he asks, how has the relationship between the worker and the factory changed under Xi Jinping's leadership?
So the most dramatic initial change that Xi Jinping carried out was the end to what had been a nascent labor rights movement in China, which I write about in my book as well. So starting in the first decade of the 21st century, migrant workers began to sort of wake up to their rights. They were educating themselves in what the labor law, for example, should guarantee them when they worked in the factories, what they should be paid for overtime. And at the same time, you saw little civil society labor NGOs spring up, particularly in Guangdong province, that would work to help migrant workers that were either perhaps not paid by the factory owner or injured in a factory accident and were not getting compensation. And so you had a real movement and a growing movement, a rights movement centered around the labor movement. Xi Jinping very quickly destroyed that, quashed it. One of the things he's made very clear from the beginning is his antagonism towards any kind of organizing that is outside of the Communist Party. So the NGOs were all shut down. Many of the people that I knew in earlier years, a number of which I write about in my book, were put in jail, and that was the end of the labor movement. So that was one big shift. More broadly, we've seen a shift, and some of this has nothing to do with Xi Jinping, but coincides with his tenure. We've seen a shift away from the typical migrant working in a factory towards increasingly migrant workers finding employment in the service sector. So as of a few years ago, the majority of migrant workers no longer worked on construction sites or in factories. They were actually working in the service sector. We've also seen, and this is actually a Xi Jinping initiative, we've seen a push to more rapidly automate the factories in China. Along with China's demographic challenge with an aging population, they also actually, a few years ago as well, for the first time, actually saw their labor force begin to shrink. And the labor force is aging as well. And this is a very big challenge for China. They're trying to get ahead of that reality by pushing more aggressively for automation in the factories. We also saw wages go up for workers as shortages started to appear in factory towns like Dongguan, starting more than a decade ago. So another big shift has been for the migrant workers, new work outside of factories in the service sector, often not very well paid and not very pleasant work. The most common service sector job for migrants now is delivery people who zip around the big cities on motorcycles and deliver food to urban residents' door. It's very convenient. You can get food in at any time of day, or deliver packages. But they're under huge pressure to do a certain number of deliveries in a certain amount of time, much like delivery workers in the rest of the world. And they also have a terrible safety record with a lot of traffic accidents related to the fact that they're trying to move so fast. So another shift has been towards a much bigger service sector employment for migrant workers.
Right. Another question from Mr. Balasubramaniam. What is the impact of Wuhan virus on China's political economy?
So as I just alluded to very briefly, what we've seen so far is, again, very impressive headline economic growth numbers, but those numbers disguising the fact that China's economy is actually becoming more imbalanced and moving away from the longer-term goal of the Chinese leadership to create a more domestic consumption-driven economy, move away from its reliance on investment, and create a more equal economy as well. What we've seen during the year of COVID, the pandemic, is instead, again, much the way that the Chinese responded to the global financial crisis in 2009. They have really opened up the spending spigots, and debt has started to build up in the economy again. At the same time, we've seen sort of a bifurcation of a growing, sort of an exacerbation of an existing gap between the less well-off and the better well-off in China. So we've also seen a real takeoff in high-end consumer goods in China, for example, that the wealthy can afford to buy. But some of the staple goods and markets for those lower-end goods have not done as well. If you look at migrant worker incomes, for one example, and migrant workers, I should mention, make up the bulk of the labor force in China. It's a huge proportion. Something, at least 2/3 of the labor force is migrant workers. And we've seen their wages stagnate over the last year, even as, again, higher income people have actually done better.
Right. Our next question is from our moderator, Shri Madra Shivraman sir. He says, Dr. Roberts, you did not cover the point on why is China spending so much on their armed forces, even though there is very little chance of their being invaded?
I think it really has to do, I think this has much to do with General Secretary Xi Jinping and his China dream. Along with trying to lift the living standards of their own people in China, which again, with mixed results, but there have been some tremendous achievements there as well. There's also a part of this China dream, a vision of having a far more powerful China on the global stage. And whereas China will tell you until they're blue in the face, officials will tell you that they, as Xi Jinping himself put it, there is no gene for invasion in the Chinese. I think that's a bit of dissembling there, because what we do see in China for many years now is a real tendency to try to push outward from its borders. And I think if you talk to the people of Taiwan, certainly talk to people in India as well, we can see that the Chinese have ambitions that extend beyond their borders. So I think as part of this China dream, and as part of another set of centennial goals, which are timed for 2049, not the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party, but the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, which will happen in 2049. They want China to not just be what they call now a moderately prosperous society, but they want China to be a wealthy country. And they also, as part of that, say that they want to have a far more substantial global presence. I think the expenditure on military has those further out goals very much in mind. I believe that Xi Jinping, to cite just one example, is increasingly determined that he see in one form or another the return of Taiwan during his lifetime. And I think he is aware that that could be very difficult without military force to back it up. So this also, I think, is driving the increasing military spending.
The next question is from Shri L.V. Krishnan sir, distinguished member of C3S. He asks, is there any information available on the extent to which rural young men join the PLA?
I think the answer is there probably is. I don't have that information. And that information is probably, I shouldn't say not available. I think that information exists, but would not be widely shared by the leadership of China. We do know that young rural Chinese have been a major part of the military force in China. It's like in other countries in the world, it's seen in some cases as sort of a route out of rural poverty, an opportunity to create a life in not very good personal circumstances.
Right. We have another question from our moderator, Shri M.R. Shivaraman sir. He asks, how did the untrained migrant laborer get absorbed into factories without training? Was it regulated by the state?
So in the early days, I wouldn't say it was regulated by the state, except in the very early days when they initially allowed foreign investors just into the special economic zones, the best known of which, of course, is Shenzhen in the early days when it was focused just on manufacturing. And in those cases, again, going back into the early days, the early 80s, the migrant workers were funneled into specific special economic zones. And there was very much a state hand in everything from wage setting. So they would tell typically the joint venture that would be a foreign company and a Chinese company, they would tell them exactly what they were going to pay the workers. But that quickly was abandoned and really left to the market. And so it's become much more market driven. I would just note quickly that the existence of the household registration policy and the fact that it ensures the vulnerability of these migrant workers in many ways puts them, is sort of like a market distortion, if you will. It means that they have far less bargaining power with factory management than they would have if this were not part of their ecosystem.
And we have one final question from Commodore Basan, sir. He asks, on your mention of improving the domestic economy, how capable is China in developing an international demand without external stimuli on which it has depended to maintain a double-digit economy in the past? What plans are evident in that area?
So I think there is tremendous potential. As I said earlier, household consumption is still very undeveloped in China, surprisingly so, because we look at the markets in China and they're huge. But the fact of the matter is, for a country of 1.4 billion people, the domestic consumption or household consumption market is undeveloped, and it's still, as I said, under 40% of GDP, which is unnaturally low. So I think there's room for them to grow that. In terms of policy, they have pursued a bunch of different things. One thing they've tried to do is skills upgrading through some training, including the migrant workers, although it's not been substantial. So they've talked a lot about trying to improve the skills of the workers. The point that I make in my book is that if they really were serious about trying to deal with this challenge, the answer is somewhat obvious. And there's many reasons why it's a challenge to take these steps. But what they really need to do is move away from the household registration system, reform it and eventually do away with it, and move away from the dual land system and allow real labor mobility and allow a much freer land market. And that, more than anything, would lift living standards and at the same time build a much stronger domestic market. Excuse me.
Thank you, Nisha, for taking up all the questions in the chat box. Before I hand it over to Commodore Vasan for his concluding remarks, may I request the moderator, Shri M.R. Sivaraman sir, to quickly add some brief comments if he has any. So you're muted, sir.
It has been a very, very fascinating presentation by Dr. Roberts. And one thing is very clear to me, because I've also been reading a lot about which is better for any developing economy, a democratic system or an autocratic system. I mean, it's very clear that of the three factors of production, land, labor, and capital, when you have completely controlled situation in regard to land and labor, capital becomes available very easily. And that's what China did. And most of the developing economies which have got, well, democracy in the sense of the term, are not able to have that kind of regimentation in regard to availability of land or even labor. So that's one reason why China has been able to develop very fast with double-digit growth in the initial stages. Secondly, as rightly pointed out by Dr. Roberts, there is a very sharp divide between the rural labor and the urban labor. Although that divide is found in almost all parts of the world, where the rural labor is not paid as much as in the urban areas. And in the case of China, it appears to be sharper than in other areas, and therefore the rural areas may not be that much developed. Well, I was in China and I spent about 3 weeks in China, but not crisscrossing and staying in the way in which our Dr. Roberts have been. But I did find that the rural areas are rather have a dilapidated look. Apart from that, the acquisition of land and the displacement of people from the Three Gorges Dam, I saw them with my own eyes, the way in which they have been treated and the way in which they have been moved out. Those things are not possible in a country like India or where a democratic traditions prevail. So these are things which completely distinguish China from other countries. And I don't know, as he remarked in the beginning itself, Charter 08 is buried in China. And probably one can never hope to see that coming back alive, not in the near future at least, unless something really dramatic happens in China, as it started happening in Hong Kong, but it has been clearly suppressed. I would like to once again commend Dr. Roberts for the extraordinary work he has done, because he seems to have traveled to every province in China and followed the life of one particular family. Now I am more than eager to buy his book, and I would like to place the order today itself, because I am not moving out of town and I hope to get it very soon. Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. It has been very, very nice of you to have spent this time with us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Bala, you're muted.
Thank you, Shivaraman sir, for steering through this discussion, and thank you, Mr. Roberts, for the excellent and insightful presentation. With this, I would like to hand it over to Commodore R.S. Vasan, Indian Navy retired Director C3S, for the concluding remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bala. First of all, I would like to place on record our gratitude to Dr. Dexter, and also for Mr. Shivaraman, who's conducted it so well. Not only did he conduct this session so well, but he also, posed some very pointed questions related to the topic on hand. I also would like to fill in some details on the center itself, because there are many international audience here. We have been in existence for 13 years now. Coincidentally, on the 4th of April, we celebrated our 13th anniversary. And the intention of getting Chennai Center for China Studies in Chennai was to move away from Delhi and get a peninsular perspective of global affairs. And therefore, I think we have done this job very well, particularly during the COVID period. And it so happens that's 2 weeks ago, on 8th and 9th, we had an important joint conference with another organization in Delhi, the Contemporary Studies China Center, which is headed by General Narasimhan and supported by the Ministry of External Affairs. And those of you who attended will know that almost every issue that Mr. Dexter has brought out in his book was discussed in detail by experts who joined us from different time zones. One was in Copenhagen, one was in Japan, one was in, and all of them had spent close to 2 decades in China. And therefore, what Mr. Dexter has brought out today has been of great relevance to our studies of China as a society. While we go ahead and discuss a lot about economy, about military strategy, about geopolitics, this issue of how the societal transformations because of state policies affect growth and various other facets is something that is rarely discussed. And therefore, I would like to compliment Dr. Dexter for bringing this to the table, more so on the closely on the heels of what we discussed in our 2-day extensive conference, which we conducted here in Chennai just 2 weeks ago. So as far as we are concerned in Chennai Center for China Studies, we made it a point to dwell on all these issues of societal changes and transformation. And under the 4 verticals that we engage in, we have economy, under which your category falls. It also has a certain amount of overlap with the societal characteristics. We discuss science and technology, we discuss geopolitics, and we also discuss soft power, where we engage in looking at the cultural dimensions of, societal transactions. So, I must say that we are very happy that, though it's close to midnight in your place in USA, you have remained awake and you kept all us up on our toes, trying to understand about this. I did go through your Twitter handle. I also went through the book reviews, and it's just outstanding what you've done. And I'm more happy to note that you also have a Chinese translation that's going to be available in Taiwan, and I'm sure many other Chinese scholars will also read it as well. So all that remains for me is to thank you personally for this gracious acceptance of our invitation to be here with us and well on issues of this, which is all coming firsthand. So it's totally authenticated, and your analysis is invaluable for us in C3S. We'll continue to remain in touch. Must also thank Mr. Shivaraman. He was about to go off to the salubrious climates in Ooty, but he's deferred that plan to be with us. So I'm grateful to you, sir, for not only taking time to be with us, but for conducting it so well. In addition, I must thank Nisha, who was the single point contact in C3S, who coordinated the entire architecture with you. And, so I must thank Nisha, Bala, and Padma, who all are our young researchers. I must also mention that, we have a Young Minds group in C3S, which has a number of 280. And, I'm very happy that it's the young minds who are, in the forefront of initiating such discussions with people around the world. The work from home or the digital platform now, post-COVID, has enabled us not to worry about finances for getting you across continents, but to engage with you at a time convenient to you so that our members benefit in a big way. So I must also thank all the participants for some wonderful questions which were posed. And I have no doubts, like as Mr. Shivaraman said, most of us will be motivated to buy this book. We'll definitely get one for our library in C3S, and I'm sure many others likewise would be motivated to get a copy of this. And we have many more such events that are happening. This week itself, we had close to 6 or 7 events, and where we engage with experts. And indirectly, while personally I would like to say that I was a victim of the Wuhan virus and I went through COVID, but the COVID also has some benefits for us in terms of such interactions that we've been able to have with distinguished people across the globe. Thank you so much, Jai Hind, and we'll continue to be in touch with all of you. Over to you, Bala, for winding up the session.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And I thank all the participants for taking their time out to be with us. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.